Today, I feel so honored to be taking part in this conversation. Normal is a failure of imagination with artists Mercedes Dorame and Álvaro de Márquez. I'm Holly M. Crawford. I'm the Director of Education at ESMoA, and I will be today's moderator. So I wanted to share a little bit about our guest speakers today. Mercedes Dorame, born in Los Angeles, California, received her MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and her undergraduate degree from UCLA. She calls on her Tongva ancestry to engage problematics of visibility and ideas of cultural construction. Dorame recently received a Creative Capital Award grant and was honored by UCLA as an outstanding alum of the last 100 years as part of their centennial initiative, UCLA, Our Stories, Our Impact. Her work is part of the permanent collection of the Hammer Museum, ESMoA, Triton Museum, Allen Memorial Art Museum, among others. Her writing is featured in News from Native California, and her artwork is highlighted in PBS NewsHour, Art Forum, KCET Artbound, The New York Times, Art in America, Hyperallergic, KQED, Artsy, Art News, the Los Angeles Times, among others. She is currently visiting faculty at Cal Arts and has shown her work internationally, including the Hammer Museum's Made in LA 2018. And visitors to ESMoA will also recall Mercedes' site-specific installation, Dwell There My Spirit, her interpretation of Tongva artifacts called cogstones and what they might have been used for, charting the night sky and creating passageways to other worlds, as well as a pictorial series of ceremonial interventions in the landscapes of Malibu at the edge of the sea. Álvaro de Márquez is a multidisciplinary artist working with printmaking, fiber art, sculpture, and installation. His work explores issues around social, racial, and gender inequality and engages questions about the self, history, and one's place in it. They hold an MFA in printmaking from CSU Long Beach, an MA in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California, and a BA in US History from Brown University. They hail from the working class immigrant community of East Salinas, California, and reside in Los Angeles County. Álvaro is the current ESMoA Scholar for Experience 47 Free State, where his installation, Ecologies of Displacement, explores a radical future while taking an accounting of the past. We also want to take this moment to remind everyone that this event is being hosted and broadcast from the unceded homeland of the Tongva. We extend our appreciation and respect to all Indigenous people who call these lands home. We also ask that everyone take a collective breath and release it for the victims of state violence who are no longer with us today. Álvaro and Mercedes, thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. To get us started, would you both share how you know each other and how and why we chose today's topic?
I know Mercedes because I've been following her work for a few years, and I was aware of the work that she's done in the Matriarch show. And we have several mutual friends in common. So I had been aware of Mercedes' work for several years. And when you invited me to think of somebody who I would want to be in conversation with, Mercedes immediately came to mind because her work has been very influential in my trajectory in the last few years.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I know ESMoA, and so when Álvaro reached out and Holly, I was really pleased to continue that relationship because I've had such a great experience with that space. And also just knowing, just starting the conversation. I mean, I actually didn't know Álvaro before this interaction. And so I knew of his work or your work, but I didn't, we had never actually met in person, which is kind of funny. I realized that a lot of people I've met recently, I've only ever seen through screen. But I just really enjoyed where our conversation began and the way that we're kind of approaching the mediums that we work in and kind of being really aware of that, their legacy, and then also kind of trying to kind of transform or press into what that means and what it means to engage with the way that we use different mediums. We had a lot of fun conversations, and I feel like the time always kind of got away from us. But what really kind of came out was this is the title of this talk, which I think Álvaro said, and I typed in the chat, like, maybe this could be the title, because we were really interested in the moment that we're in and kind of engaging with time and space and the land, but then also this feeling, and I've had this conversation at other times as well, where it's like we don't want to go back to like this idea of normal. And that's complicated, and I know we'll talk more about this, but it was really provoking me to think of seeing the potential and imagination of what can come instead of trying to get back to something that was.
Same. I mean, I know that for me, from our initial conversations, I feel as though, Mercedes and I work in pretty different mediums and different approaches, but there was a lot of commonality I felt in terms of the conversations we're having within the medium. And also from the conversations, what emerged was a shared interest in thinking really critically about what that call to normal means, right? Especially in a time where things have been seemingly abnormal this whole year, but so many of the things that have shaped this past year have actually been quite normal for US history. They haven't really been anomalies in a lot of ways.
Right. Oh, sorry, Mercedes.
No, go ahead. I'm like a nervous air filler, so please go.
That is a-okay. I'm a Gemini, so I'll try not to fill the air too much. But Álvaro, I think you raised this point about this idea of the return to the call to normal, and for I wanted to kind of pick that up a little bit. How can we interpret these recent calls for normalcy, and what does that really mean when we're asking for a return to normal? And I think this isn't well, I won't go too far into I won't talk about the election too much, but there was this thing about like going back to normal, and I was like, what do you really mean by that? And this was definitely something that came up in our conversations as well.
For me, this idea of reflecting on this call of normalcy, I think I saw it most pronounced this summer with the protests and the uprising against police brutality. And I saw sort of, I'm very active on social media, and in a lot of activist circles, I saw sort of this resistance to this idea of going back to normal, which I think has only gotten stronger in the context of the last election, right? Where Joe Biden has been elected and people have been celebrating like, oh, look how normal the press conferences are. Look how normal our domestic policy is. And for me, I think that's where that articulation came in our last conversation, that normal is sort of like shows a lack of imagination, right? That we should really think about who that normal has been working for in the service of what goals, and perhaps what we miss in trying to immediately go back to that normal.
It's complicated for me because I think about some of the things that I miss, right? And it's like, the interactions with other people. And so that part of like going back to having interactions where there's exchange of actual, touch and energy and those kind of things, I do kind of have this longing for. But I also agree that, all of the disruption and all of this shifting has created space of change. And I was thinking about this quite a bit early on, well, not early on, maybe midway through our time of, COVID. And I was thinking that so much had changed in our behavior, right? We were used to going out and putting masks on. We're used to kind of keeping this strange distance from people. There's like almost a physical reaction when someone gets too close and you get kind of cringy, right? And that happened within months. And I was thinking, maybe globally is too big of a word, but culturally, societally, at least where I've been, that has shifted and behavior has changed and ideas have changed and reactions have changed. And I was like, if that much can shift in such a small amount of time, like what is the potential? Because so often when I think about bigger changes, ideas that could really shift and change the dynamics of that we become so accustomed to, right? I mean, I don't want to go off on a laundry list, but if those things could change in such a short amount of time, like there's a lot of potential in that. So if we like use this moment of acknowledging that really collectively a lot has changed in such a short amount of time, that kind of to transition that into like, okay, like what else can what can we get rid of also, or what can we build in that could be really accepted and part of society in like such a really months, you know. Sometimes I think, oh, these big changes have to take years and years, and you know, maybe my daughter will see the result of something that I'm doing, you know, and it's kind of compressed that in the timeline for me quite a bit.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think that it's been pretty astonishing to see how much things can radically change in 1 year. And I know that I recently had this discussion with somebody. I don't argue on Facebook with people anymore, but I do engage with people who want to have a sincere conversation. And I described this idea that I had about just sort of imagining sort of like utopian possibilities, right? So many social movements, especially in the Black radical tradition, has been imagining these like radical things that maybe seem impossible in our lifetime. But I think that one thing that has been really made clear to me, and that I discussed with this person on Facebook, is he was saying that, oh, well, if you're calling yourself utopian, you're already admitting that you're chasing windmills and that it's like a fruitless endeavor. And I thought that that was very short-sighted, and that shows a lack of imagination too. To assume that radical change is somehow chasing windmills, right? Like that we're already setting ourselves up for failure. I feel like it neglects the fact that so many of the things that we appreciate today, like labor laws, like whatever minute progress we have made around civil rights, has been because people have really dreamed up radical ideas to shifting what that normal is, right? Because we have to remind ourselves that a few hundred years ago, slavery was normal. Indigenous genocide was normal. There's so many things that we now look back in time and realize that they were atrocities that were normal in their days. So I think that if we were to act from a place of imagination, it opens up so many radical possibilities, right? I mean, I remember this summer hearing all these calls to defund the police, and whether or not people agree with that, I tend to agree that, you know, we should shift our priorities in society and not give so much money to these carceral networks. But that was a radical shift, and that happened in a matter of months. And I know that a lot of activists have been calling for that for years, but literally in a matter of 2 or 3 months, that went from being something that was completely on the margins of a radical imagination to being part of everyday calls. So to me, that really impressed upon me the importance of really resisting the urge to go back to normal. And I remember hearing these calls back in June, July, and I feel that in the context of this last election, people want to, I understand why people want to have this sigh of relief of like, oh, the orange monster is gone, we're back to normal. But again, that to me is a failure of imagination, because that normal served a particular imperative in society, and that's not one that necessarily benefits everybody.
Which now I'm wondering, like, who does normal work for?
I mean, that's a big question. I don't know if you have thoughts, Mercedes. I've been talking a lot.
Well, I kind of wanted to pick up a little bit when you said like seemingly impossible, like these things that seem impossible. And I love engaging with things that are seemingly impossible. And if any of my students are here, they know I gave this reading that was about this kind of knowledge. I don't know if I can do this quickly. accessing knowledge that maybe existed before you, or post you, kind of messing with the timeline of how we create. And when I think about like my work and trying to access ancestral knowledge and this kind of ancestral history and imagination and cosmology and understanding, it's kind of a big leap to say like, oh, I'm engaging this, like I'm connecting in with this knowledge, right? And whether or not that is a, you know, artistic or personal pursuit, I feel like it's those kind of leaps where you kind of have to embrace these things that are seemingly impossible. And I know that's like a little bit of a shift away from like maybe the political, but I do think that it's like when I think of how to do that, I think about my art practice, or I think about how I approach making work. And I think that that's not just something that artists are capable of, right? Like I don't think that it's this special skill or, you know, thing that I only have as a you know, person who makes things. And so I kind of like to posit or like put out there that, you know, we all have this potential to kind of access or tap into what is seemingly impossible. And like you said, these ideas that were radical at one point now seem like, well, yeah, of course, like slavery is wrong. Like how could we even think that that's something that is good? Or I mean, there's so many policies of land, of, you know, home access, mortgages. I mean, there's so many policies that exist that kind of keep us in a certain structure that, yeah, maybe we can think outside of that and shift it. You know, I think about both of our practices being very rooted in place, right? Where we come from, that what is the history of that place? Why is that important? And so I think it's kind of like this push and pull of like accessing down and like those roots in order to kind of get into that space of imagination.
Which
like I said, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, which I think I'm going to redirect my question, which is something you've tapped into, which is imagination is accessible to everyone. And so these radical ideas, right? They are wide open. And as we've seen in the last, I mean, it's not even in just the last few months, but as Álvaro, you've noted, with different movements that have come before, there's always these routes through imagination, through creativity, whether it's through a movement or through an artistic practice. These nodes are available to everyone. So, and Mercedes, there was a link there because I was like, oh, like how that link is explored through both of your practices, and like what would these new movements, maybe I'll hold on to that question, but what does like this radical imagining look like? And we've seen examples of your work, but where are you with that right now in this time?
You have to go first, Mercedes.
No, go ahead. I just was chatting a bit. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I know for me, like I'm working on a project right now, which is kind of it's pretty ambitious. I'm thinking of this idea of imagining what a decolonial future actually looks like, right? Like if we take, you know, I've been doing a lot of readings on settler colonialism and sort of racial capitalism and environmental justice and ecocide. And, you know, at least for instance, like I love science fiction, right? And so much of science fiction is it puts together these dystopian futures, right? Like the worst case scenarios. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what if we were to imagine like a best case scenario? What if like decoloniality took place? What if the calls for land back were actually answered and changed on a structural level? What if our relationship, especially now, right? It's in the context of like the ecological disaster that we saw this summer with all the fires, right? Like, what if we were actually to envision a future where these things were not quote unquote seemingly impossible, were actually followed with like policy decisions and shifts in political economy and shifts in how society worked? Like, what could that world look like? And it's not to say that I have the answers, but I feel like if society or people in general felt the agency to feel like they could imagine alternatives, then the things that seem so natural and a given now wouldn't seem so natural. You know, it makes me think of this British scholar who used to write about common sense, Raymond Williams. He's really well known in cultural studies, and a lot of his work was really about like detangling how the very idea of common sense was not particularly common. It served particular imperatives. And normally, it serves capitalism, it serves patriarchy, it serves so many of the things that we consider to be normalized, right? So in imagining these other possibilities, it's really about stopping the assumption that the world we live in now is the only one that's possible. That's where this line of reasoning kind of takes me, right? Like to stop assuming that this state of affairs is somehow inevitable or the only thing possible.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think about where I kind of touched on earlier about how we use the particular mediums that we use. And, you know, I do a lot of sculpture and installation now, but my roots really are in photography, and I use the camera, you know, extensively, thanks to my father who's here, who I inherited a Rolleiflex from and have made a lot of work with. But I know the history of photography as well. And I know that it was used early on as means to document Native people, in pseudosciences such as like phrenology, where it was about coding people as other and then kind of being less than, right? Or early on in police work, this idea that the photograph is this evidence of something that is. And, you know, I like to engage that in a way to rethink it, right? To kind of play on this assumption that I'm showing an image to be made real. I think about, I mean, it's kind of funny, but I actually have the ESMoA prints up behind me. Thank you all. They're up in my studio. They're beautifully done. But I think about when I make these images, it's to recode these spaces as Native, right? How we look at Los Angeles as a space isn't, you know, it's Hollywood and Griffith Observatory and the downtown skyline. These visuals are not, the indigenous presence is not always represented. And so for me to use the camera and point it at a space and say, okay, this is permanent. This is a permanent presence. This is a continuum of presence is kind of how I'm getting into this language around it. And using a tool that is maybe at one point used to erase, or like the whole, you know, Edward Curtis vanishing race, like it's like a way of articulating to the past. For me, it's really about reinserting that presence into the present moment and into the future. And so I do that with the camera. I do that also with the installations of, you know, that kind of human print, right? It's also this idea that, you know, sometimes I kind of, so my early days in photography were on a newspaper, which I don't always talk about. And so I had these like photojournalist roots of like, you know, you are an objective observer. And I've come to realize like, no, we're never, you know, what is presented is always subjective. There's editing, there's kind of you know, so many decisions that are made before that presentation point to another person. And so when I think about that as well, I always want to show that presence, the human trace that is in the landscape, because it goes at this thing. I mean, this is kind of very roundabout, but it goes at this idea that you're talking about with like traditional ecological knowledge around fires and land management. You know, early photography also showed the American West as being this vast wilderness that was untouched and there for the taking, you know, but there have been people in this place for millennia, right? And there's caretaking and tending to that spaces. It's not just this untouched, you know, maybe it didn't look like a farm or a European garden that was recognizable to some of these people, but it didn't mean that there wasn't care being put into the land. And so for me, it's always about this interaction of the human presence in the land. And I was going to also talk about monuments, because that's the other kind of vein of imagination that I've been engaged with. It kind of, but I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'm just going to go. Is that all right? And this is a little bit of a shift too, but I think about, in the same way we're talking about big shifts happening in a really quick amount of time. I mean, there was years of work around the removal of monuments, years. I mean, I think I saw Joel Garcia here, if you're there still, who's been kind of a mentor in this for me, because, there's been years and years of work happening, but then all of a sudden there was this moment and this shift and these things came down, in ways that at other times took years, or didn't happen. And so that's been this huge imagination for me, to be like, what do we look up to now? What are we posturing our bodies to like acknowledge? And that gets into all other conversation, but I would argue that it's like connecting to the sky and the cosmos and the stars, and with these installations I do of this kind of looking up in order to look down and like be rooted in the ground. So it's still that kind of upward vertical kind of movement. It can't just be up and it can't just be down. It has to kind of involve both. But those are like the realms that I've been kind of thinking through in these recent months.
Right. And again, too, like this idea that you presented earlier about how do we tap into this conduit? And something that I'm interested in too, I grew up in Baltimore, and I remember very distinctly 3 Confederate monuments in very popular places where people have to walk by them. One was in front of the Baltimore Museum of Art. One was directly in front of the Walters Art Museum, and another was in front of my alma mater, the Maryland Institute College of Art. So you could not escape these things. And when you did research about them, these things weren't built immediately after the Civil War. They were bought and paid for and built in the 40s or 50s, right? And now they're not there anymore. They don't exist. The interventions around them have been really spectacular. Another reason I thought of this today, BLM Los Angeles, in honor of Black History Month, is sharing stories about Black pioneers, Black historians, Black artists. And someone they shared about, who I've also made work about, is Henrietta Lacks. And if anyone's familiar with Henrietta Lacks or HeLa cells, she has immortal cells that are still living, but her cell line has been used in research from polio all the way up to cancer. And one of the things that I'm hoping for is in the next several years that there will be a dedicated monument to her. What that looks like, how does that shift? I don't know, but her family is part of that tradition, of that monument tradition, and sharing her story. And I wonder too, is a monument, is a physical monument enough when her DNA is practically written into everything? And so yeah, something to think, made me think about that, Mercedes. Álvaro, do you?
I know, I'm trying to be quiet for a minute.
This is also how our conversations tend to go as well.
I was just thinking a lot about, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I was so excited to be in conversation with Mercedes, because I think that, I know that in my work, right, like Mercedes was talking about the history of photography, and it's how it's kind of a fraught medium. I feel that printmaking is very similar. I'm a printmaker at heart. I've also started doing more sculptures and installations, I'd say in the last 2 years, but the root of my practice is in printmaking. And printmaking also has a really fraught history in that it's been used, at least like in post-revolutionary Mexico, it was a very radical medium to articulate revolutionary ideas, but printing technologies are also sort of a European invention that were used as a tool for colonization, right? Like when Christopher Columbus came out to the quote unquote New World and went back to Europe to discuss his travels, he published a book. And in the book, there was woodcut prints depicting this New World, right? And prints were themselves used as a really important tool for mapping the New World and disseminating this information. So in my work, I try to think of both the fraught part of printmaking, but also this radical potential that it has within it. And I think that in my work, I approach it quite differently through my subject position as a Chicanx person, but really also trying to think about denaturalizing Los Angeles as this place of Western settlement. And I think that there's even like there's a quite frankly there's a Mexican fantasy of this being sort of this mythical Aztlan and being this used to be our country, you know, this used to be part of Mexico before it was taken away. And in my work, I'm trying to say, well, sure, it was part of Mexico, but even Mexico was a colonial residue, right? That was premised on indigenous genocide and erasure. So I think that in the work that I try to do as a historian is really thinking about the role of these histories, not only in the shaping of the place we now call Los Angeles and the Southwest, but in how it is that these processes are so they're so loaded ideologically, right? That even within a call within Chicanx culture to reclaim this ancestral territory, it's also tied into the colonial project, right? And to me, that's what's so interesting and so fruitful about printmaking, that you can use the tools of a medium that was brought by colonization. You know, the first press was brought to the Americas, to current day Mexico City in the 1500s. And so for me, I'm engaging in this history and sort of subverting the tools of that of the medium in a way that I find more productive.
Thank you. Oh.
I mean, I think that it's interesting kind of how there's this shared kind of impulse to re-envision or reshape what is known of a city that's pretty well known or has a pretty concrete image. And it makes me think, I had this conversation with an ecologist around another potential project, and she was explaining how people talk in that realm about Los Angeles, that it's, you know, there's kind of like this color coding that happens where there's like green space, which is good, and red space, which is bad. And then there's the gray space, which you just kind of like don't even touch or bother with. And she was like, much of Los Angeles is considered this gray space. And I just like, I thought about that, you know, because I grew up here, right? I grew up in this place. And I remember being a kid and people would always be like, you know, I'd hear adults talking and they'd say things like, oh, I love Los Angeles, but I'd never want to raise kids here. And I remember always thinking like, wait, like I grew up here, like, what does that mean, you know? It wasn't until I visited that maybe it was like Ohio, and I was like, okay, this is like what the like idyllic, you know, suburban white picket fence thing is. Anyways, like it makes me think of the access points and the spaces in the city that are like, that still have this feeling, or I have this connection, or this greenness to them, like the landscape, I'm always kind of trying to find these spaces that have this visual presence of native people, like, you know, water springs and places like that, or these hillsides that I've worked in. And, you know, it's kind of back into this kind of question around imagination of the future. The other thing I've noticed quite a bit during this past year is everybody is just flocking to these spaces outside, right? Like I go to these parks, there's certain places I love to go, and it's just, you know, it's almost like that desperate need to connect with something visceral. And I think of like being in sunlight has that visual, it's like almost like touch on your body, right? And so it's like this need for interaction, and right now it's happening in these natural spaces. And so I think like, okay, envisioning the city moving forward, maybe we prioritize these open spaces and make them more accessible and bigger, and maybe don't like, you know, cement over everything that seems like where a good house could go in a housing development, and, you know, privatize every speck of, you know, profitable land. Like maybe we think about that differently, because, you know, I think about people also leaving this place, you know, because of that, right? People want to be somewhere where you can have those kind of interactions. And so I think that there's like a shift, you know, hopefully happening about prioritizing those kind of spaces as well. And finally kind of touching and talking to, you know, touching in on or talking to like the indigenous people, or people who have this knowledge of the cities and the traditional ways of maneuvering them, or kind of interacting with them, that aren't so destructive. I don't know. I feel like I was, yeah, just like the idea of reimagining what this could be.
Same. I mean, I think that to me, like in the conversations we had leading up to this, right, it was really about, I mean, for one, getting a sense of like what can we talk about, but I think one thing that emerged was this idea of reimagining, right, which I think has been a thread in this conversation. And I think that at least in the work that I've been doing, and this is where I feel like I look to your work, Mercedes, right? Like really understanding that there's this filmmaker, Alex Rivera, who made this film called Sleep Dealer. And I love it because I won't spoil it, but at the end of the movie, basically the answer to the issues that he's responding to is by looking back to ancestral knowledge, right? Like by looking back. And so to me, it seems really interesting in the context of, say, like managing forests, right? That we can look back to indigenous practices for imagining a way forward, to imagining this other relationship to the natural environment. And I think that's so powerful, that we think of futurity as coming up, like reinventing things, when there's already knowledge out there that can help us navigate this radical future we want to envision. If we were just listen and are open to going outside of these Western epistemologies of the enlightenment, of trying to control the environment and trying to think of the natural environment as a resource, right, for the extraction of profit.
Yeah, and I think it takes some courage to, it's taken some courage in me, maybe I'll say, to kind of claim those things, because yeah, on top of, um, yeah, it's sometimes very difficult to say, okay, this is what I'm doing. But I always, I guess, like, you know, when I'm, I guess, to a broader audience, I always want to say, like, pay attention to those little moments that like make sense or hit. I think about right now I'm taking Tongva language classes, and it's a really kind of amazing experience to kind of work through those words. And there was a certain point where I, you know, the person who runs them makes us all talk, you know, which is good, but it's intimidating because it's a lot of difficult, or not difficult, but different sounds, right? So it's this unfamiliar set of sounds. But when I say the words, they just sound right in my mouth. Like they feel comfortable. And I remember kind of acknowledging that to myself, that there's a connection there that makes sense, and you feel something, and that's validating in a way that I can take that and move forward. And I think that if we all pay attention to those moments of where something, okay, that feels right, like this is clicking, and don't dismiss it like, oh, I'm just imagining this, or oh, that's not real, or that's just some other input. It's like, no, you're touching something, you know, whether that's emotionally or, you know, energetically, but it's connection. And I think that in the same way, it's the reason why I think this last year has been so hard, because it makes me understand how much of the human interaction is about that kind of energy exchange too. I teach, you teach too. I mean, I'm sure you can understand, Holly as well, you know, what does it mean to kind of have to do this without, it's almost like there's a lot of energy out, but like that feeding in, that reciprocity isn't the same. And you know, there's a lot of things that I love that I can talk to some of my students who are in, you know, completely other sides of the world, and that's an amazing thing too. So there are things to be gained, but I do very much, it's made me really recognize how much of that energy exchange between people is so generative and like fueling that the energy of just like your ability to kind of continue.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think that's the one caveat that I would add to this resistance to normalcy, right? There's the normalcy that I miss is that energy exchange. Like I just taught my first online class yesterday to a room full of faces on a screen, right? And I miss the sharing of space, the subtle forms of communication that take place that are lost on a screen, right? So I'm happy to say, you know, fuck normal. Let's not go back to normal. But there's a few things about normal, right, when it comes to social, our lives as social beings that are obviously something that people are grieving, right? And I think that's something that came up in our last conversation, right? Where is the space for grief, right? I think that by sitting in grief, by sitting in the discomfort, there's so much to be gained from that. And that's almost like, I feel like so problematic. It's almost like a Buddhist principle, right? Where you learn from pain, you learn from suffering. And I think that this last year, there's been a lot of understandable suffering. There's been a lot of pain, but I think there's a lot that can be learned from that. I think pain can be a really great teacher. The sense of grief, sitting in grief can be productive, even if it's not always comfortable.
I agree with everything you both have shared. And I think this idea of grief and how important it is to normalize grief. This is something else that came up in our discussions too, because there really hasn't been time for grief. And even thinking about how we talk about grief as a collective, it's very, that conversation hasn't happened yet. Something that I'm in the process of grieving right now as a queer person is the loss of queer spaces. Which was already happening prior to a global pandemic. Thank you, gentrification. But just seeing the list of, and the thing is about queer imagining is that queer spaces will pop up anywhere. We'll find a warehouse and we'll make it happen. We'll find a field, we will make it happen. We will find a space to make it happen. And it doesn't have to be off world. It is here, it is in the now. And that's something that I've also been like, okay, I have to, in order to return to normal, I have to grieve the things that that I was inducted into thinking that were just normal, that I couldn't have a queer space if it wasn't in a club, or I couldn't have a queer space if it wasn't, yeah, I don't know. But it's, yeah, I'm grieving the things that, well, I have to say goodbye to, but I'm also very excited about this radical new imagining. And I also want to invite our guests to ask questions.
There's a question from Veronica. I'll read it out. Hi, Álvaro and Mercedes. Thanks again for sharing today. I have a question regarding the red strings that you both implement in your work. What do they mean in your own individual practices, and how will you utilize them today and in the future? You want to go first, Mercedes?
Sure. I mean, I've used the red yarn quite a bit, so I have like a multi-layered answer. I'm sorry. I really started working with them when I was making a series called Sinews, because I was thinking about this need or this desire to have a really linear understanding of past and present. And this, like, as a Native person in Los Angeles, where these kind of holes in the history and the culture that are really hard to grapple with. And I was thinking about how sinews are these parts of the body, like this kind of messy, really important structural things that allow you to move like this, right? Like a straight line, maybe I could like go like this, but like, you know, the way your body is in this messy connectivity, is necessary. It's also kind of these bloodlines of you know, what does that mean of connecting past ancestors to the present. And then I really started working them structurally when I was looking at my work on archaeological sites, when string was used to delineate a meter square, which is a way to look at the earth. And I was really intrigued by this approach of putting a very square structure on top of a really organic space and trying to figure things out in that way. So those are the two big things. And then, you know, as they function in the installation, they kind of become this visual pathway up, this idea of creating space. You know, what does it mean to create a line that is permeable? Like, I create these installations with like a round structure that you probably wouldn't walk into, but you really could, you know, physically do it. So these ideas of creating space and vertical looking, that posturing, they kind of often become these light beams, these echoes of light beams looking up.
I mean, it's an interesting question. Actually, I started working with red yarn as well a couple of years ago. And then, to be honest with you, Mercedes, I came across your work and I thought, oh shit, people are going to think I'm copying Mercedes. But for me, it was a practical concern, right? Like, as somebody who identifies as non-binary, I've really tried to think about sort of my gendering and sort of the art practice that I engage with. And I used to have this problematic assumption that I had no artists in my family. And I realized that was total BS because my grandmother used to practice embroidery and knitting. And so I realized that I was neglecting this matrilineal art making in my family by not looking at that as art. And so that became a catalyst to think about how it is that I can use a quote unquote feminine art form, such as embroidery, in my artwork. And I started embroidering maps. And the red yarn was just a practical decision. I wanted something that was going to highlight the cartographic shapes that I was working with. And the red just, it has that visual effect where it really outlines the perimeter. But then when I came across your work, Mercedes, I was like, shit, maybe I'm in a conversation with Mercedes in this, right? Like, it's not about copying you, like, because that thought came to mind. I was like, oh shit, like, it's already Mercedes already did it. I should stop. But for me, it was really about like really thinking about the gendering of art, right? Like how it is that certain art forms are either derided as craft or as feminine labor. And so I started embroidering maps to highlight the creation of private property in what we now call Los Angeles through archival maps. So I think it's kind of a cool thing that links us up in our practice.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And I also just want to share, everyone, that Veronica is ESMoA's social media coordinator. And so they designed the materials for this evening. And we are so appreciative for you, Ver. So it's good to see you here. We have some other questions in the chat too. This question is from Nelson. Álvaro and Mercedes, how do you embrace contradiction in your work?
You want to go first, Mercedes, or?
No, go for it.
I mean, I think for me, contradiction is inherent to sort of existing in life, right? So for me, I don't know, this is such a like metaphysical question, and it's a good one, and I hope that I can do it honor. I think that I embrace contradiction in my work by embracing the and, right? Like I don't make work to say this is the only answer. I'm saying like printmaking can be radical and it comes from colonialism and it's a tool of colonialist discourses, right? In looking at the construction of Los Angeles, what we now know as Los Angeles, I think, for instance, like, yes, it's this great multicultural expanse and it's built on stolen land, right? So the contradictions are built into the artwork already.
I think, yeah, you answered that one. I don't know if I have much to add. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add on that, unless there's like a real specific, I don't know.
Well, I have another question in the chat. This is from Yohel. I'm hearing, reading, and just overwhelmed with the amount of good intentions to reset our society. But most of those frameworks still center a settler society. What advice could either of you give to others listening in, incorporating or centering First Peoples and remaining a future that doesn't replicate the current erasure? And that there's a note, without creating more work for them.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's,
Go ahead.
if you want to jump in, Racine.
I mean, I think it's a very thoughtful question, because it's this caveat of without creating more work for them, which I, can relate to in a way that, I get a lot of calls of like, can you explain this to me? Or can we talk about this thing? Or can you be a resource? And I think that there's like a two-part thing in me that says, rethinking how we approach artists and kind of indigenous people. And for me, those things overlap. And so often it's kind of like, in the past, maybe before this exact moment, there's this, you'd get this request for information, and then you'd have no idea where it went, what happened to it. It's like that was taken as a resource and used somewhere else. So there's no compensation, there's no acknowledgement, there's no like footnote of like where it came from. And so I think that can be problematic. And then and it also makes me think of this experience I had on a granting panel. So I was one of the panelists looking at these people applying for a grant. And it was this grant that was like funded by a tech company, saying like, what would happen if we gave artists like a whole lot of money? Like, what would happen? And I'm like, they'd probably make really cool shit and like do something exciting. And so I think that there's a little bit of, I think that some of what is uncomfortable for people is relinquishing some of the control, maybe, and just giving space. Like, I think I'm working on a project right now, which allowed me to get a studio for the first time ever since grad school. And it's amazing. And it's like, given the space and time and resources, artists can do amazing things, right? You kind of just have to have that trust. And, that's been some of my best experiences with museums and institutions, where they say, okay, here's the place, like, we'll build you a platform, and you get to come in and do this thing that they don't really know what you're going to do. They just there's like that trust. So I think that this is a little bit conceptual, but like the trust and relinquishing of control, and kind of letting go of, whether that be space or time or resources, acknowledging that that's something that's been lacking both in resources for Indigenous people and also among artists. It's a really hard thing. A lot of my friends have been hit so hard during this time because, because artists aren't always valued, I think, for their time and for their work. I think about, I teach, and so there's often this conversation about value and how you kind of assign value, and having to value yourself and your own work, and the years and years of experience and time and reading and research and labor that goes into a piece that might seem like it effortlessly just appeared right into the space in a magical kind of way, which it does, I would argue, but it's like without all of that labor that goes into it, it wouldn't exist. And so it's, I don't know if that quite answers, but it's I guess my feelings on it.
No, I really appreciate this question, Joel, because I think that like when I resist this call to normalcy, right, I think about, I didn't watch the inauguration because I just was not interested, but I saw in the whole social media realm how, I think it was Jennifer Lopez who sang "This Land Is Your Land," right? And to me, that was precisely the wrong type of normal. That's precisely the problem with normalcy, right? Joel is pointing this out in a really succinct way, right? Like, normal in this is a settler society where we keep singing these problematic songs that say, this is your land, this is our land, this is our like, that replicates sort of the logic of settler colonialism to say that this land is somehow manifest destiny, supposed to be this great empire, right? And that I think that like if I'm reading Joel's question correctly, is like, how do we decenter a settler society, right? Like normal is a settler society, right? So by calling back for this reset, you know, with good intentions, it's really going back to the status quo. So I think this question that Joel asked us is really getting us to think about, you know, how can we reset society without having to necessarily return to that status quo?
What is something that you're looking forward to?
I'll let you go first, Mercedes.
Well, I just wanted to, Brandy actually put a question in that we kind of skipped over, but and maybe this is my final thought, because it's like, what suggestions, advice, guidance would you give to artists in this time of feeling out how to explore, respond artistically to life, cultural, personal experience, collective experiences in this time, right? So that's a big question. And I feel like it's also like a nice, for me, a closing thought of, you know, we all kind of have this potential to acknowledge what we do as having value, of having importance, whether that be the way you make your coffee in the morning or how you kind of interact with another human being. And I feel like when I think about making art or kind of responding to these like life and culture, I think that everything that when I'm thinking about how I make work or how I respond to the existence, everything that has kind of become a part of me gets processed through, and that's what can come out, right? And so I try to stay open to and receptive, kind of, I mean, it's sometimes tiring, but like all the time, because so often I'll be walking somewhere and see something, or reading the news and come across something that's really nurturing or to my practice. And it's kind of like just remaining open to those moments and experiences, because those, if you remain open to it, it's kind of like the more you remain open, the more you see. And if you're kind of stuck in like a tunnel and you kind of only accept, you know, a certain existence, you kind of don't notice those big, beautiful things happening, you know? And it's so when you kind of open yourself up to imagination and possibility, you'll start to see things and acknowledge, you know, and be able to recognize them in a way that's really different than if you feel like it's not possible. And maybe that's a little bit too like wooey gooey or whatever, but I do think it's really important to have that posture as you move through the world, even physically, the way you feel when you're sitting like this, like I do when I'm driving or teaching, versus like when I'm walking outside and I'm in the sun, you know, it's a different feeling, and that feeds you. So that's maybe where I will end.
No, I mean, just to echo that, I think that for me, and this is something, you know, I'm in therapy. I've been in therapy for a long time. I'm like, I got an individual therapist, I've got a queer therapist. And one of the things that I've been exploring that I think would be like life advice, not only for artists, but just for not even advice, just sort of this is how I take things, is to maintain a sense of curiosity, right? Like a lot of my work is rooted in questions. I don't start off an art project thinking, I want to make a sculpture. I start with a question. I'm like, why is it this way? Why is this thing this way, right? For like in the last few years, I've been doing work on gentrification, issues around the unhoused, issues around redlining and segregation. And it all started with a question. It was like, how did this come about, right? And I think for me, that helps me to maintain a sort of a critical stance on things, but it also helps me to sort of to stay curious about the world, right? Like not make assumptions about the world around me. And so my artwork is really a way of understanding the world around me and my place in it. So I think that that curiosity is so important, especially right now that we're all stuck at home and that social interactions are limited and that our social bubbles are so constricted. what helps me is to have questions and to maintain that curiosity. And before we go, I want to thank Holly and everybody at ESMoA, and I want to thank you, Mercedes, as well, for sharing digital space with us today. I've learned a lot from your work, and I appreciate this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you. I know it's always hard to find time to do these things, but it's been such a pleasure. And ESMoA has always been so supportive, and Álvaro, it's been so wonderful to get to know you as well.
Without further ado, everyone, thank you again for joining us for this really thoughtful and humbling conversation.